Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my job to give you a warm-up this morning. Thank you for being here with us, participating in this session. I would like us together to reflect upon sexually motivated, let's say, or sexuality-motivated violence. That's something that all researchers who are researching violence, they have discovered it, and they are pretty much aware of it, of the fact that people have sexes or genders. Half of people in the world are female, the other half more or less males. I'm going to show you a part of a research project, or talk about a part of a research project that talks about peer violence that's motivated by sexuality stereotypes, including violence that's motivated by sexuality or sexual violence. This project that I'm going to talk about is co-funded by the, it's towards its final phase, and soon on our website you'll see materials for parents. That's a screenshot from this website that's going to be finalized soon, and that's going to have materials for parents. All research in Poland and abroad indicates that peer relations at school, outside of school, are relations that are relations between boys and girls. And the fact that it's boys and girls having those relations has a number of consequences. I regret that I couldn't speak yesterday directly after the film, because that film actually in the afternoon showed very pithily what scenarios, what consequences related to sexually motivated violence, what kind of scenarios, what kind of consequences there are when a boy or a girl is the perpetrator. And I might be stating the obvious, but those of you who live in Poland, you know that the word gender that's used in Poland exactly with the English pronunciation gender, and well, this word has become a little bit of a sort of inflammatory word, and gender, that's something related to cultural roles, something that's related to historical roles, a lot of definitions, a lot of factors, not just purely related with physiology. So any basic history course or any journey abroad will show you that biological potential, both in boys and in girls, is realized completely differently, is expressed completely differently, both for girls and boys. Right now we can see very many solutions and very many many paths in which both masculinity and femininity will develop. What turns us on also in a sexual and a bodily sense changes in culture, changes over time. Right now we have reached this, we're sort of socialized and trained to fit into those roles and notions, and both kids and adults. So the purpose of the study, of the research, was to identify forms, the scale, the characteristics of cases of peer violence that's motivated by sexuality and sexual stereotypes and gender prejudice. I'd have to say that, well, differences between boys and girls and their behavior, they are registered, of course, in any research, but no one ever draws any conclusions for prevention and for sort of prophylaxis activities, even though the differences are there. If you look at anti-violence or violence prevention programs, it always talks about adolescents, teenagers, youth, but very rarely do they take into consideration the fact that the violence has different scale, with different intensity, touches boys and girls. It's different depending on gender or depending on sex. So my study would be was how do stereotypes, sexuality-based stereotypes, how do they influence boys? How do they influence girls? No one is born with prejudice. No one is born with stereotypes. That's the result of our culture, of our upbringing, of our nurture. So I'm very much interested in how school and how we, professionals at school, how we can impact, influence the process of reproducing these stereotypes that then might turn into violence and might influence boys and girls differently. My sample was around 400 participants, more or less equally 50-50 boys and girls. They come from 27 schools across Poland, both in small villages where kids have to commute from neighboring municipalities, but also I have participants from prestigious schools in big cities. But anyway, violence or sexuality-motivated violence is something that on the one hand is their everyday life, but on the other hand is a bit of a taboo. So I tried to select a number of different research methods. I did IDIs, I did questionnaires with open questions. I did 20 focus groups, I did 20 individual interviews, so IDIs. And what I think is really valuable here in my research, I gave my participants a task to do a photo story, just using their smartphones, that will describe a day in the school life of a girl and a day in the school life of a boy. Now, very briefly, let me tell you about some patterns that we have discovered, confirmed by every piece of research that we've seen so far. And we can tell very clearly that physical, direct, brutal violence with weapons, all sorts of weapons, as well as sexual violence, these are things that is the boys' specialty, but on the other hand, boys, more often than girls, are victims to all kinds of violence, maybe apart from sexually motivated violence. So they generally are victims more often. The gender effect or the sex effect is not only reflected in aggression, it also is reflected in other risky behaviors that are harmful for the health. Generally, girls, for example, are more sort of negative and have more negative attitude to authority, to teachers, and so on. In Poland, nearly 90% of perpetrators of felonies or offenses are boys. And this does have a set of consequences for everyone, for our lives. Only 3%, or as much as 3%, of perpetrators that end up in penitentiary institutions are women, girls. So something that starts very early on in junior high, actually, or it might start towards the end of primary school. So these things that start as early on then go on to be very grave consequences for the whole society. So let's talk about cyberbullying. Our data is not very clear, not very conclusive, but we know from studies that boys more often than girls specialize, so to speak, in indirect forms of violence. Therefore, the cyberspace seems to be a perfect tool in the hands of a girl, because they can indirectly manipulate, influence relationships, influence people's emotions, use violence indirectly. The studies that we have access to unequivocally indicate that girls and boys are equally perpetrators of cyberbullying acts, but girls are victims more often of cyberbullying. Boys tend to attack in the cyberspace, both girls and boys, while girls, when they attack in cyberspace, when they perpetrate acts of violence, this is mostly against other girls. As you know, violence, bullying is always a form of getting an advantage, controlling others, doing what you want, making sure others do what you want. So I'm using here the notion of the hegemonic version of masculinity. So where boys in modern cultures are quite pretty early on trained to use. This model is a model that's based on the notion of the perpetrator and the victim. And I've done an experiment. But I've only changed the headers. So that was victim perpetrator, and now I changed masculinity to change these into masculinity and femininity. And they are very close. Victim perpetrator, femininity, masculinity, they are sort of hand in hand. They come sort of hand in hand. And sometimes we lose the ability to influence boys and girls and their relationships at a preventive level because we ignore what we already know. I would like to show you some results of my research now. So, boys and girls, but especially girls, every day are victims of the so-called, as I call them, micro-trauma. They don't call these things that I'm showing. So, peeking, pushing someone, publishing intimate and private pictures, using sexual or sexually colored expressions or sexual allusions and gestures and sounds. They don't call them actually acts of violence, but they experience this every single day. Comments about private parts, comments about the looks, staring, stalking with obscene text messages, sharing on social media pornographic material or some private pictures. These are pictures from the photo stories that my respondents were tasked to create. So a day in the life of a girl and a day in the life of a junior high school boy. So as you can see here, this is the leg on top is the leg of a teacher who was on duty at that time in the corridor, in the school corridor. So she knew, she saw that was the picture that the kids were watching, but nothing was done. Sexuality at school is an everyday occurrence. I call it the gray zone, the zone in between. We call it gray zone because no one talks about it, but these acts are violent and they are visible. So it's not a gray zone because it's hidden. It's a gray zone because no one talks about it. But you can see it, plain sight. So I've printed out sequences of photos, sequences as the photos go throughout the day of those boys and girls, and I came back to them with those photo stories printed out in sequences, and I asked them to narrate me through this, like what's this, what's that, what's happening here. Well, that's something that is being done across Poland in every single junior high school that I've been. What they do, well, every person that goes, that leaves their desk to answer the teacher's questions or something, they are at risk that everything they left behind or leave behind at their table will then be painted over with small symbols of a penis. So whenever you leave your stuff, there's a risk. The problem is the virtual and the real there's absolutely no line between these for young people. Whatever they do in their textbooks, whatever they tell to one another in the school corridor, the same goes on in social media. It's one life. There's no line between the real, the virtual, the online, the offline. The problem is that adults, for a multitude of reasons, and I don't have time to talk about those reasons, but for adults, well, they don't see that problem, or they choose to sweep it under the rug, or they do even worse. Many forms of sexually motivated bullying is ignored or made light of, saying, well, that's what kids do. They are immature. Boys, they're boys. So girls are left without any support whatsoever. And they have to learn that in this culture, it's okay, it's normal, that your comfort zone is persistently violated. And you know statistics of sexual violence and domestic violence in Poland. So, well, you can draw your own conclusions. Thank you so much.